So tonight's vice presidential debate reminds you of what debates are supposed to look like. We had Senator Kamala Harris, who was on the other side of the debate stage from Vice President Mike Pence. Plexiglass totally blocking them off. I'm still wondering what was the busted blood vessel in Mike Pence's eye, but I digress. Tonight's debate was moderated by Susan Page. And I would say, let me just rate the moderator out of the gate. The moderator tonight was much better than Chris Wallace, but I'm struggling to understand why she wrestled with giving the same amount of time to Kamala Harris as she gave to Mike Pence. Mike Pence fought her on whether or not he could have more time to respond to something Kamala Harris was saying, and she gave him that time despite the fact that it was time to move on. I will commend her on saying that both campaigns said they would adhere to the rules, and her being able to shut down at that point, which I think was important. And then she said that she was going to move on to the next topic. Now, overall, I would say Kamala Harris most definitely won tonight's debate on substance, on poise, on looks that could kill, and on all the things that Black women and Black mamas say or have said to kids who are acting up. The other greatest winner of tonight's debate was the fly that landed on Mike Pence's head. There was nothing like it. I believe that the Mike Pence fly was there to tell you all one thing only: vote. Now, as for the rest of the debate, I think it's really important that we started with coronavirus. At this point, there are more than 211,000 Americans who have died because of the debate. That's not talking about the number of people who have suffered, and some suffering permanent consequences because of the coronavirus. Kamala Harris started strong. She talked about this administration's failed response to the coronavirus.
210,000 dead people in our country in just the last several months. Over 7 million people who have contracted this disease. 1 in 5 businesses closed. We're looking at frontline workers who have been treated like sacrificial workers. We are looking at over 30 million people who in the last several months had to file for unemployment.
And how many more lives could have been saved if we just adhered to the rules that medical professionals, that scientists are telling us to abide by. What was fascinating to me is, in addition to, I will give, this is probably the one moment that I would give Vice President Pence a little bit of credit for, this plagiarism burn of Joe Biden. Well played. The rest of this was trash. When you start talking about the death toll being higher in this country, and then Mike Pence going into, well, let's talk about the the swine flu response of the Obama administration in 2009. Somebody should have told Mike Pence that 12,469 people died due to the swine flu. How many people have died in America due to coronavirus? 211,000. Those are incomparable. It's not the same thing. So when you start talking about, well, we've responded in an unheard of amount of time with this vaccine, what is unheard of is coronavirus. Let's treat this as the novel, right, virus that it is. It's so important for us to do that. But we also have to debate with facts, something that he continued to remind Kamala Harris of every step of the way, but failed to deliver his own set of facts, especially when we talk about what was the super spreader event at the White House, where they named Amy Coney Barrett as their Supreme Court nominee. They weren't following the very guidelines that scientists and medical professionals have told us to follow. Tonight, at the end of the debate, you see Kamala Harris's husband, Doug, go on the stage with a mask. Where was the second lady's mask? Why are these people playing these games? We do not need to see your teeth more than we need to see your mouth covered. Like, I don't understand. So the other thing that I want to go back to COVID, or before I leave COVID, make mention of Kamala Harris's lines about how calm were you, basically taking a dig not only at Mike Pence's response, alleged response to COVID, but also his demeanor, which is always pretty even-keeled.
When asked, well, why didn't y'all tell anybody? He said, because the president wanted people to remain calm.
Well, let's get
no, but Susan, this is important.
Susan,
I want to add, but
here.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
I have to
I'm
weigh
speaking.
Yeah, you
So
can have
I
15 more
wanna-
seconds, and then we'll give the Vice President
Thank
a
you.
chance to
So I
respond.
want to ask the American people, how calm were you when you were panicked about where you're going to get your next roll of toilet paper? How calm were you when your kids were sent home from school and you didn't know when they could go back? How calm
Thank
were
you.
you
Thank
when
you,
your
Senator
children
Harris.
couldn't see your parents because you were afraid they could kill them?
Super effective. It wasn't a line of attack, it was a line of facts. And I think that she did that very well tonight. I think the other thing that we need to talk about is when Kamala Harris said,
And they knew what was happening and they didn't tell you. Can you imagine if you knew on January 28th as opposed to March 13th?
you respect the American people when you tell them the truth. Perfect line, because that is one thing we know this administration has wrestled with. They do not like facts. They seem allergic to them. And I think that's why the fly landed on Mike Pence. I'm currently going through a little cleanse, but I just have to say this. Thank me later. The reason why the Pence was on this is what I get, because I'm not supposed to say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway still. The reason the fly landed on Mike Pence's head is because he's full of horse shit. Now, moving right along. There was a moment where we got to see a discussion about transparency on the stage. Kamala Harris brought up health and taxes. In the question from Susan Page about the candidate's health, how old Donald Trump would be if he were to win this election, how old Vice President Biden would be if he were to be sworn in as president, 74 and 78 respectively. And Kamala Harris used that, I think, as an effective moment to pivot on taxes, on the amount of debt that Donald Trump has. She says, debt. Let me tell you what a debt is. A debt means you owe money to somebody. And with the head nod, super effective, okay? It's clear. Every black woman in America knows what this means right here. And tonight, y'all learned today. The other thing is this line around how much time Joe Biden has spent in public service. I thought this was effective from Mike Pence, talking about Vice President Biden's 47 years in public service. But I do want to take this moment to let you all know that Mike Pence ain't no spring chicken. Mike Pence ran for Congress in 1988. He ran for Congress in 1990. He lost twice, and then he tried and finally won in 2000. And so that's one thing that I think is important. One thing I should also make mention of, because some folks are calling this debate boring, what you really saw tonight was civility on the stage. There were moments where they both commended each other. Shortly thereafter, they were telling each other things that they said are not true. But I think that civility is important in this nation's discourse. Even when you have policy disagreements, you can still do so respectfully. The economy. When you talked about the economy, I thought Kamala was super effective when she said that Donald Trump determines the strength of the economy based on how rich people are doing. Very effective. And she said on day one, Joe Biden would repeal Donald Trump's tax bill and reinvest that money into the American people. Mike Pence used that as a way to kind of drive home the fact that the Biden camp would be raising taxes on the American people. Kamala used that as an effective moment to say, no, the taxes would only be raised on people making $400,000 or more. The environment pieces I thought were really tricky. I didn't feel like we got straight answers from either candidate, actually. When, Mike Pence is talking about the air and the water are cleaner.
Our water is among the cleanest in the world.
Hello, Flint. Do they have clean water yet? What has Donald Trump done about that? He talked about signing the Outdoors Act, which is the largest investment in public environmental spaces and parks. I have to fact check that personally, but one thing I struggle with is whether or not they really believe in science, because every time they brought up climate change, this fool talking about the climate is changing.
Now, with regard to climate change, the climate is changing.
We're not talking about going from spring to summer. We're not talking about going from summer to fall. We're not talking about fall to winter. We're not talking about rain versus hail versus snow. We're talking about climate change. Climate change. I need them to understand this is real, right? Like glaciers are melting, like earthquakes are happening, like wildfires are like happening. So what are you talking about? Kamala was super effective on this. And then, oh, by the way, he said we're going to continue to listen to the scientists. I want to know, when did you start listening to the scientists, my G? When did you start? We haven't seen it. We can't tell. Your wife didn't even have a mask on tonight. Anyway, so around the Green New Deal, I thought that this was a great opportunity. And I understand, you know, when you get to a general election, it is the expectation of the American public that the candidate begins to moderate. And so for Kamala, I think that her being one of the first sponsors of the Green New Deal in the Senate is actually a badge of honor. And given the fact that young people will make up a large swath of this electorate, and we need to figure out ways to engage them, I would love for her to say, yes, I signed on to it, and yes, I want to continue to unpack the answers around what you all think is in your best interest to save the climate. That is so important. And I think that even if she's saying, you know, maybe my position has evolved, that's okay. In this life, we are human beings, and we don't always have all the answers. What we know is that we have to save this planet for young people. And I would have loved for her to say that. I also would have loved for her to just say, you know, it's so funny because tonight I'm being told that I'm too progressive. In fact, Mike Pence has said that Newsweek has labeled me the most progressive member in the Senate. But if you listen to some people in the party where I'm coming from, I'm not progressive enough. Which one is it? I think it was a great moment for her to also get into that. I think the issue around fracking as well, that came up later. But I would have loved for her to say, you know, fracking has some unforeseen consequences. You know, we still have to unpack a lot of this. I said I was opposed to fracking in the primary, and that's something that I'm still very interested in understanding. I want to hear from the people who would be impacted in terms of jobs, but I also need to be responsive to what these young people are demanding of me and requiring of me. I think it's okay to be honest. In fact, I think it's required. We're in a day and age where people want to hear the truth from their elected officials. And whether we like it or not, Donald Trump's approach, he be lying, but Donald Trump's approach seems like he's not going to be PC. He seems like he doesn't kind of tote both lines in one answer. Now, if you listen to him for longer than 5 minutes, you know he's going to be on both sides. But she doesn't have to do that. And so I would have loved to see her do that tonight. I loved switching gears to China.
Trade war, they wanted to call it, with China. It resulted in the loss of over 300 manufacturing jobs and a manufacturing recession.
When she talked about the trade war with China, she said, you lost. And then an even stronger moment is when she said, and America lost almost 300,000 manufacturing jobs. By the end of this administration, there will be more jobs lost than any other administration. That enough should be a reason to cast the ballot against this administration. Do you know what we're experiencing with COVID? Like, compound that with COVID. That is untenable. Mike Pence calls the coronavirus the Chinese virus, right? This is something we can't turn a blind eye to. This is the type of xenophobia where Donald Trump started his campaign in this. Mike Pence didn't back away from it. He doubled down in it. We need to be paying attention to that. I love the moment where the moderator asked Kamala about the strains in the world because of American leadership. And Kamala used this great opportunity to talk about Donald Trump betraying friends and how he's embraced Russia. I feel like Kamala tonight got the opportunity to stand flat-footed and land a punch at Mike Pence, one that Joe Biden failed to do last week when challenged about his son and Russia dealings, and he didn't strike back on Donald Trump and all of his unethical behavior with Vladimir Putin and with Russians. Particularly given the Mueller report. By the way, shout out to my podcast. Listen to it. I read the full Mueller report, all 400 some pages of it. So I know the Mueller report, and all I'm saying is she successfully landed that Russia punch tonight against the Trump administration. And she even talked about how Donald Trump trusts Vladimir Putin over NATO and the FBI. Super important. I think the other thing that was important, Mike Pence tried to pivot this into a conversation around ISIS, taking digs into the Obama administration about their handling of ISIS, trying to demonstrate that they've handled ISIS in a great way, or, you know, have handled it well. And then Kamala pivoted and talked about how Donald Trump said that John McCain was no hero. because he was a prisoner of war. She also defined what a bounty was. And she talked about how Donald Trump talked to Vladimir Putin 6 times and never brought up the fact that there were people, U.S. citizens, who had bounties on their head.
Public reporting that Russia had bounties on the heads of American soldiers. And you know what a bounty is? It's somebody puts a price on your head and they will pay it if you are killed. And Donald Trump had talked at least 6 times to Vladimir Putin and never brought up the subject. Joe Biden would never do that.
Given everything that was going on with Russia, with ISIS, and she mentioned that Joe Biden would never do that. I thought it was a really effective moment. The Supreme Court nomination. Podcast coming for that too, or I think it's out now, so you should definitely listen to that. Dream team of legal experts talking about what should happen. Why didn't she say she would pack the court? Of course she should say we should pack the court. I wanted to hear that. I love the 1864 history lesson, and when she talked about 27 days before the election, Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe, should have or did the right thing, did not name a Supreme Court justice. And what are y'all doing? Mike Pence told you what y'all was told y'all what he was doing. However, this was a great opportunity to demonstrate that Democrats, progressives, have a spine, have a backbone, and will say, we're not going for these over-politicized courts. We are going to ensure that the judicial branch is fair, and we're absolutely adding more justices to the bench. Didn't happen. The line around 27 days before the election, which is actually happening right now, as she also stated, was clear. History lesson was clear, but I would have loved to hear her say, in addition to supporting and will always fight for a woman's right to choose, that we absolutely will pack these courts. I hope that's where they are. I haven't heard Joe Biden or Kamala Harris answer that in the affirmative, but that's where I am, in case you want to know where I am. I'm Angela Rye, and I approve that message. Breonna Taylor. This answer was hard for me. It's a simple, justice was not served in this case. Daniel Cameron should be ashamed of himself. Mitch McConnell should be ashamed of himself. Rand Paul should be ashamed of himself. Everyone affiliated with politics on the state, federal, and local levels in Kentucky who have not fought for justice for Breonna Taylor should be ashamed of themselves. NBA players and kids all over the country should not have a clearer outcry, a clearer call to action on what should happen in this case than the public servants. Justice has not been served. It is not right, and that is clear. She talked about speaking with Breonna Taylor's mom and how wonderful of a young woman she heard Breonna Taylor was, and that's wonderful. But as a former prosecutor, knowing how this works, I want to hear Kamala hit this a little harder. I love the moments when she talked about being a protester, not only for George Floyd, but for every black life that should matter, that must matter. And it was a phenomenal way to, and I hope that young people saw it everywhere, demonstrating that yes, she took this oath of office, and yes, she wants to serve as your vice president, but she absolutely is still with the people. Kamala's campaign motto in the primary was Kamala Harris for the people, and that's what she said. She said every time she walked into the courtroom, and her being there, her standing with the people side by side, not asking for a platform or a microphone at those protests, I think says a hell of a lot about who we would get in as a vice president. The fact, though, that Mike Pence used that moment not to say that he thinks that justice was not served in that case, but to say that he thinks that he trusts the justice system, and then to pivot to rioters and looters, and not understanding that there are white terrorists, domestic terrorists, who have been egging on protesters, who have been getting involved on the ground in cities and states all over this country as agitators. That's who he needs to be condemning. This rioters and looters thing is a boogeyman strategy that we don't have time to unpack tonight. But he ought to stop, and he ought to be ashamed of himself. Again, while the fly sat on his head. I wish that Kamala Harris would have taken that opportunity when she started talking about Donald Trump's failure to condemn white supremacy, failure by this administration. And I'm very clear that they're threatened even by implicit bias training, in diversity training in the federal government. I'm very clear that they don't and have never loved us. But what I'm also very clear about is that Kamala Harris is for the people, and y'all, that's why I'm for her. Kamala Harris won this debate. She won my vote. She's on the ticket because of her, and I hope that she will continue to stand boldly. She doesn't have to say everything about Joe Biden and what Joe is going to do. Sis, we want to hear from you and what you're going to do. We know that you have our back on that ticket, and again, that's why we have yours. Much love, y'all.